Vicki Troxel Harris. I'm an old middle school teacher and loved it. So you know that I have to be a little crazy. But while I was teaching in Arcadia, Nebraska, my superintendent came up to me and he slapped some books down on my desk and he said, "Here, you take care of this." And I looked down and the first book I saw was Teaching Tolerance. That was the title. And this was multicultural education. Well, I don't know what the word tolerance means to you, but to me, I'm tolerant of snow in the winter because we're going to have it. And I'm tolerant of ants at a picnic because I can't get rid of them. But I refuse to teach tolerance of any culture or even any subject. If I can't teach appreciation for it, I won't teach it because I'm kind of stubborn. But I grew up with wonderful neighbors and friends who were African American. And they influenced my life in many ways and what I did. And I wanted others to know them. So I called my friend in Omaha and I said, "Can you come talk to my kids?" And she said, "Oh no, dear, I'm much too old and my health is not good. But if you come down here, I'll tell you some stories." And that's where it started. And after they did, they just snowballed. I got letters from everyone that I had ever known. Then I got letters from people that just heard about me and thought it was a good idea. And it just made a difference, a terrific difference in my life at the time. I am so thankful that this happened. These are the Buffalo Soldiers. And sometimes that's the only thing we know about the Black culture in Western Nebraska, just because we have so few people living out there that are of African American descent. Now, other people will tell you that we never did have very many, but that's not true. We did, but they just weren't included in our history books. The Buffalo Soldiers, there were two cavalry units, the 10th Cavalry and the 9th Cavalry. The 10th Cavalry was stationed at Fort Robinson near Crawford, Nebraska, clear up in the western part of the state. And they were there to protect the homesteaders that came into Nebraska. The 9th Cavalry was stationed at Valentine at the north part of the state, about in the middle. And they were there for the same purpose. Now, the 10th Cavalry was quite famous because during the Spanish-American War, when Teddy Roosevelt came over San Juan Hill, he wasn't in any danger because the 10th Cavalry had gone ahead of him and cleared the path. And the 9th Cavalry was north of where I grew up. So I knew more about them than I did even the 10th Cavalry, but both were very famous. And they got along very well with the Native Americans. And so they got a lot of accomplished that maybe a white unit couldn't have gotten done. For one thing, they were wonderful horsemen. They were wonderful with any animals. And they never caused any trouble. They didn't get in trouble. They were just good citizens, and many of them stayed in the area after they were dismissed. This is the Spies family. And this is one of the families that I did know. I didn't know these individuals, but the next generation down. They had quite a story. They were slaves, and they were released and given 40 acres that they could own themselves as long as they paid a rent and went to the plantation store for everything they needed. In the plantation store, there was food, there was equipment, they could even buy a mule through the plantation store. And the owner said, we'll just charge it. And when you are able to pay your bill, we will sell your crop that you raise, and I will buy it, and then I'll apply all the money that you have spent at the plantation store to your account, and everything else will be yours. Well, Moses was a good farmer, and he was in love with Susie. Susie worked in the big house. She cooked for what she said were quality people. They'd had a hard life. Susie had many scars on her back from being beaten. And Moses had worked hard always. But they got along fine with their 40 acres for a while. And then it appeared that when they sold their crop to the plantation owner, that he didn't always give them enough. And they would go deeper and deeper in debt until now they were again enslaved by the debt they owed to the plantation. So they smuggled Moses out under a hay rack load of hay. And they took him into Indiana over the Underground Railroad. And he worked in Indiana where he sent every dime back so his wife, Susie, and their young son, William Henry, could come into Indiana too. Because they wanted William Henry to go to school. They knew that education was their ticket to a better life. Eventually that happened. And Susie and William Henry arrived in Indiana, and he did attend public school. But one night when he was on his way home, he was attacked by a group of young thugs, and they knocked him down, and they threw rocks at him and other things like broken bottles. And William Henry came the rest of the way home carrying his eyeball in his hand, because one of those broken bottles hit his face and removed the eye. Well, needless to say, they left Indiana. And they made their way west, and I lost them somewhere in Illinois, and I've never been able to go back to see if I can find that. But they came into Nebraska down by Seward, and there were two other homestead families that came at the same time. And they got to talking. One family was from Prussia. And the man from Prussia said, we're going to take out a homestead, and my kids are going to grow up on land that they own, and nobody's going to be able to tell them what to do on it. And the man from Germany said, yes. He said, that's what I want to do. But I know nothing about farming. I'm just a school teacher. So Moses Spies made a deal with him. He said, if you will teach our children, I will teach you how to farm. I will help you build your sod house. And when the 5 years on the Homestead Act is up and you own your land, then we will be paid we will have paid each the other what we owed. And so that's what they did. And then the Species sold their place, and they headed west, farther to Custer County. And they came in, William Henry, after he had lost his eye, never liked to have his picture taken with a patch over it. So he'd always remove the patch and turn to the side so that no one could see him with that patch. So anytime you see any of this group in a picture, he will be looking off to the side like he isn't paying attention, but that's not true. They came over the hills east of Westerville one Sunday afternoon, and the people in Westerville were having a picnic down in the park because their church, they needed a church, and they didn't know how to build it. They had a lumber yard right there in Westerville where they cut the lumber, but no one had the expertise to build it because they had just built sod houses up to that time. When they came over the hill, they came right down where the picnic was, and they introduced themselves and said, "We're going to be your neighbors. We're going to take out homesteads about 3 miles west of here." St. Pierre. And the people told them their dilemma about the church. And Moses said, "You don't need to worry about that because my brother, Jeremiah Shores, is a master carpenter, and he is with us, and he and I will help you build your church." This is the Shores family. Now, Jeremiah Shores and Moses Spees and their brother, Joshua Henry Webb, were all full brothers. But you see, when the slaves didn't have last names, they would take the name of their plantation owner. But Henry Webb said he wasn't taking the name of his plantation owner, he was cruel to him. So he didn't. He just took the name Webb and said that was how tangled his life had been, because the owner had clipped the cord in the back of his heel. And after that, he walked with a tall staff and leaned on that staff with everything he did. Now, Henry never did marry, but the other two did, and they looked after him all of his life too. Some of the people that settled at that time were people that went into Broken Bow. This is the Conrad family. And Lacey Conrad drove the taxi, and he'd meet you at the railroad station, take you anywhere you wanted to go. His brother Clint cooked at the Arrow Hotel, and he made ches pie, and everyone loved it. They would come, and they would be given a piece of this great golden pie, much like pecan pie, only Clint would take a handful of cornmeal and throw in there instead of the pecans, because we don't raise them here. He was a master mathematician. He could take a column of numbers and go down it with his finger and add them just as fast as his finger would go. And yet he spent his life cooking, but he did it so well that it was an honor just to have him here. Billy Young was from Bolus, Nebraska, and he came through, as many did, from one settlement to another, and he fell in love with the Shores' daughter, Luella. And they were married, and they had this little girl. Her name was Glendora. And later she married a Sayers and would have been like an aunt to Gail Sayers, who came out of Omaha and played football. And we all remember him. Billy Young was a blacksmith, and he would fix anything that you brought in. And he made all of the branding irons that people in the area used. And he had a blacksmith shop in Dunning, Nebraska. He said his whole goal in life was to live in the circle of God's will. And he did that pretty well. When kids would come in with little toys, he would fix them free. He had a pile of wagon wheels and tongues, and that was the usual thing that broke. And then if they had little cars, he had some little tires for those too. When he died in the early 1930s, he had the biggest funeral that they'd ever had in Dunning. They had to use the community building because there wasn't a church large enough to get all the people in there. Along about this time, I ran into some information that I hadn't heard before. There had been a place in Canada, in Ontario, North Buxton, Ontario, actually, and it's just across the river from Detroit. And a Reverend King had started a place there with his own land for escaped slaves. And when they got into Canada, they would locate Reverend King. He would take them to North Buxton, and it was an all-black town, and he had the final word on everything, and it was, you will be educated, and your spiritual life will be taken care of. You had to go to church, you had to go to school, and the one I really liked was you have to learn a trade so that you can give back to your community what you take from it. So anyone who came out of North Buxton in the census was always could read. And they always attended church, and they built their own. But they traveled clear on back into Nebraska and settled in north of Overton. And they were there for several years. But at one point, they kept drying out, which is not uncommon in Nebraska. We don't get quite enough rain. And they didn't raise good crops. And everyone was having to take another job. And a man by the name of Clem Deaver had worked on the railroad, and he came down visiting, and he said, well, what the heck are you doing down here on 160 acres? Don't you know about the Kincaid Act? The Kincaid Act, government says, you can take 640 acres up in the Sandhills for the same rules that you used to prove up on your homestead. Sounded good. The Kincaid sections were popular, and people moved into the Sandhills like you wouldn't believe. The railroad was behind it, and they were pushing this land. And of course, the ones that got there first got the best land. So they loaded up their wagons once again, and they headed northwest to the North Loop River. And when they got to Brownlee, they kept right on going 8 miles up the river west. And that's where they started their settlement. It was a settlement of Dewitty. They called it that because the man who was the postmaster's last name was Dewitty. And they got along great. There were over 100 families. I've seen several different ideas of how many there were. I am guessing somewhere over 150, but I don't know that for sure. You who are interested in doing oral history have to realize that when you do this and you get a story, you will have anywhere from 3 to 5 versions of the same story, even if you're asking someone of the same family, because we don't all remember things the way that the other person does. And of course, this had been a long time. These people moved about 1904 to 1907, and they settled in the Sandhills. Okay, they came in up over the hills, and they thought they'd surely found the land of milk and honey, because you can see the wildflowers, and they had the North Loop River that didn't ever flood much, and was just a kind river that came down through, but there was always water, very, very little. And this is what they needed. But as I said, the best land was already taken. So they just took pretty much what they could get. And in the sandhills, since they didn't have enough to have a ranch and run cattle, they could run a few, but not very many. And in the sandhills, if you plow that land up, you have about 3 years that it'll grow almost anything. And of course, it does rain frequently, so it's usually pretty good for you to depend on, but not always. Then after about the 3 years, all the nutrients in the soil leaches away, and all you raise is a blowout. When the plants come up, the wind shifts just a little on those tender plants, and that sand is so sharp that it just cuts them down. This is Hester and Charles Meehan. Now, they were actually the leaders of the group. Hester was from North Buxton, and Charles Meehan came in and married her, and they were leading the group back into Nebraska. Hester was a nurse, and she and my grandmother Kate, during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1917 and 18, crossed color lines many times because they nursed the whole community. Many times after they left a place, they had helped bury as many as they had saved. Charles was very capable. I need to stress how intelligent these people were. They were very innovative with their ideas. And Charles had a bit of a an advantage when he came to the Sandhills, because he had 4 sons with him that were able to take out Kincaid sections too. So here there were 5 people that were taking land. There was 50,000 acres that were settled by African Americans in that area. But there were a lot of white people at the edge or in the settlement also, but they just weren't included in the group. But they also had land somewhere in there. The Kincaid Act set people up for failure. Poor land, poor information going around, and it didn't matter what your skin color was. A lot of people just about starved before they got out and figured out that there wasn't any way they could make a living on 640 acres. These are the 4 Meehan boys. Now, Billy Meehan was the runner, and they would get together on picnics and everyone would bet on Billy, and occasionally there'd be somebody come into the settlement and they thought they could outrun him. Well, he would run the first 2/3 of the race, and then he'd turn around and wave at whoever was behind him, because he could run as backwards as fast as he could forwards. Now, Den Meehan was an innovative thinker, and he raised sorghum. And then in the fall, when he cut his sorghum, they pressed it and used it to make a molasses, and everybody, again, would come to his place to get the molasses that they needed for winter. They used it for a lot of their cooking, ginger snap cookies, and lots of things, baked beans, lots of things that they used molasses for, because white sugar was hard to come by. This is the town of Dewitty. This is the post office. And Miles Dewitty named it after himself. Well, they left after the first 6 years and went to California. And Den Meehan, because he had a high school education, became postmaster. And he said that Dewitty was the dumbest name for a town he had ever heard. So he changed it. He changed it to audacious. And it was audacious for the rest of its life in that area. Eventually, a neighbor bought the building and took it to his place for a cake house to hold feed. And this is all that's left of it. There were 3 all-black schools in the Dewitty settlement. This one was the school of one of the little Speece girls that I knew. She's clear to the right and back one. This is Ava Speece. And she used to come back to Westerville because that's where her grandparents had gone to church. And she'd go to the church in Westerville and visit with all the people in the area. These people were valued as friends. They did amazing things. Now, out of the Speece children, she was not 17th, but there were 17 of them. But Ava was the one that we knew the best. There were some older boys at one time who were causing some trouble in the school. It was not the Speece children. And Leanne Riley said, this teacher will never be able to handle them because she was only about 5 foot tall, if that. She's very small and tiny, just a tiny build. Well, about the 3rd week of school, there was a rattlesnake that came in, popped himself in within the reach of the desks. And she walked over and she grabbed that snake by the tail and she snapped his head and threw him out the door. She never had any more trouble with those ornery boys. This is the all-black church. It was the African American Methodist Episcopal Church. And there used to be still one in Lincoln, and the minister is right in the middle of the picture with the glasses. That's Reverend Burkhardt, and he came out and got the churches started. The man standing next to him is one of the settlers, and actually the last settler family that ever left Dewitty, and his name was Albert Riley. Now, they were friends of ours. My dad said there was not a finer man in the country than Albert Riley. And we would have to agree because so was his family. There was another settlement. There's several settlements. And I'd love to tell you about all of them, but neither one of us have time to do that today. It was south of O'Neill. And there were a group of coal miners. Someone said out of Iowa, but they did actually mine coal out of the Missouri banks down by Nebraska City. And it may have been some of those. Some of the names were the same. And they were duped into coming out by a couple con men. The con men took their wagons and they took 2 wagon loads of coal and went out into the sandhills, dumped their coal in 2 or 3 or 4 blowouts, and then they advertised this land for sale. Well, 14 families of coal miners came to the area. They spent everything they had to get there and with their equipment. And once they cleaned out the coal that had been dumped in the blowouts, there wasn't any more. 14 families are quite a few to find jobs in an area like O'Neill because that's still sandhill country. And there aren't very many people who live in it. And their buildings were poor. Some of them, there was a lot of sickness because some of them just got too cold and they didn't have good, nutritious meals. You can't raise enough on them. And it was a sad thing. They called this settlement bliss, but it wasn't very blissful. Now, there was an old man that I think came with this group, but he was not a coal miner. And I was giving a program in O'Neill one day, and this elderly man uh, had a walker and had come with his wife. And when we were through, he came up to me and he said, my wife wants me to tell you this story. And bless his heart, he told me. He was talking about Humphrey Hill. And Humphrey Hill had come with the coal miners, and he raised garden vegetables. And many of the family who came did not starve because of Humphrey Hill. He gave away a lot of his produce. And then he sold some too, so for his own survival. And just north of him, this elderly man had grandparents who lived there. And they loved Humphrey Hill. He was the best neighbor you could ever have, and he furnished anything they wanted out of their garden, his garden, for them. And one they told about one August afternoon that a tornado came through. And the Archibald Tompkins family went to their cellar. And when they came back up, it hadn't hit their place, but it went south of them. That's where Humphrey Hill lived. And they went running down because they were afraid it might have hit his house. Well, it did, but Humphrey was okay. And the only thing left of the house was their cook stove that stood right in the middle. And they looked out to the barn, and the barn was down, and the corrals were down, and everything was just rubble. One old chicken was making his way out of it. And Mr. Hill had gone to the field where he picked up a skillet. That's a frying pan. That's what they called them. And he was coming back to the house when Mrs. Tompkins ran up to him and said, Mr. Hill, what in ever will you do? And he said, not to worry, ma'am. The Lord did provide. I have everything I need for supper. And he did. He had his stove, his chicken, and his skillet. And I tell you, folks, if we had that attitude today, there wouldn't be anything we couldn't do. Now, it wasn't all work and hardship. When Black people would get together for a dance, the music would abound. They were wonderful. The Brown brothers played the dances and would clog dance as extra entertainment. The combo, made up of Turner Price and Joe Price, Boss Woodson, and Mac Boyd, played for the dances from Broken Bow to Alliance. Along about 2 a.m, Boss would get tired and sometimes dozed off, but his mouth would drop open a little and he might emit a hint of a snore, but he'd never miss a beat on the mandolin. These settlers were progressive, innovative, hardworking, and good, kind neighbors. Their descendants have told me these studies display this, their story. Just a minute, I'm sorry. I'm going to start that over again. These settlers were progressive, innovative, hardworking, and very kind neighbors. Their descendants that have told me these stories display the same superior intelligence and have continued their contributions to society. The faith and humor with which they met life is an example for each of us, and a heritage in which those of African American descent can take great pride. I hope you enjoyed these stories as much as I've enjoyed gathering them. Thank you. And it's about a barber in Grand Island. He came in in the 1870s and started a barber shop, and he did extremely well because he spoke fluent German. And many of those homesteaders along the Platte River were German descendants. And so they were delighted to go in and get their hair cut and talk their own language. And he was very successful, and he built a bathhouse, and he was very interested in the whole community. He was a fireman. He did everything he could do to be a good citizen. And he had this wonderful sense of humor. And you know how it is when someone makes us laugh. We like it. Well, Tommy Goodchild had one of his patrons come in one day, and he was so excited. And he says, yeah, I brought my clothes because he said, I need to get a haircut, and I need I need everything. My young brother is coming, and he's going to live right here by Grand Island, and I'll get to see him. And I haven't seen him since he was just a wee lass. Oh, and I want to look my best because he's never seen me. He wouldn't remember me. He doesn't know what I look like. And Tommy said, really, he wouldn't remember? Tommy and the patron said, no. How would you like to play a trick on him? Was Tommy's answer. So they did. And when young Frederick and his wife and little girl got off of the train, Tommy went out to meet them. Ah, my brother, he said, in your beautiful Fräulein. And oh, I'm so glad. And Frederick said, who are you? Tommy said, well, I'm your brother. Don't you recognize me? Oh, you were so small. But Tommy said, but your complexion. Or not Tommy, Frederick. I'm blew that one too. Frederick said, your complexion. Oh, he said, don't worry about that. When you've been in this Nebraska heat and sun as long as I have, you'll look just like me. And then the real brother came out. And I just have always loved that story because I felt like that sometimes. Nebraska isn't the greatest climate, but it's the greatest people in it anyway. Fell in my lap, and by the grace of God, and that's a whole nother, the faith these people had. You know, how could you go through day after day? We've been through COVID. That's nothing compared to what these homesteaders went through.
That's absolutely the truth. Yeah. So, well, we thank you so much for joining us. The American History Film Project thanks you so much